Dust swirled in the canyon's heat, a golden haze drifting over the carved amphitheater where thousands of armored figures knelt in silence. Their helmets gleamed faintly under the light, a sea of bowed heads that formed the backdrop for the duel about to unfold. At the center of the arena stood Caliph, blade in hand, her skin the pallid blue of her people and her eyes like polished obsidian, reflecting every detail with predatory stillness. She had trained since childhood for moments such as this, ritual combat, public tests of skill and strength that upheld her clan's pride. Her opponent should have been a worthy rival, another warrior bound by honor. Instead, she faced a human. The outsider stood opposite her, dust clinging to his travel-worn armor. He lacked the ornamentation of her people, wore no ceremonial sigils, carried no weapon steeped in legend. His sword was iron, practical, without a single rune to sing of ancestry. Yet he had walked into the canyon without hesitation, challenging her directly, as though centuries of her people's traditions were no heavier than the sand beneath his boots. His presence was an insult, and yet, perversely, it was also fascinating. The clan had mocked him from the moment he arrived, certain he would falter. Caliph herself had laughed when he demanded single combat. But standing here, watching the steadiness of his gaze, she found no trace of fear. She tightened her grip on the blade of Dominion, its black metal etched with runes that had not glowed in living memory. The weapon's weight was more than physical. It carried a legacy, binding her to every warrior who had ever held it. To her, the duel was a matter of duty. To him, she could not yet discern the reason. Was it arrogance, desperation, or some hidden agenda? The drums began, low and rhythmic, echoing through the canyon walls. She advanced with the measured confidence of a predator, every step deliberate. He raised his sword with no flourish, no practiced ritual, only a readiness that felt strangely honest. Their blades met in a clash that rang across the arena, metal against metal, force against determination. She pressed him hard, testing his footing, his reflexes, expecting the stumble that would expose his weakness. But he moved differently than her kin. Where her strikes were precise, his responses were erratic, unexpected angles, sudden feints, an improvisation that seemed almost careless but never left him open. The crowd murmured, unsettled by his survival through the opening exchanges. Caliph narrowed her focus, doubling her speed, letting instinct sharpen each blow. The human grunted with effort, but did not retreat. Dust rose around them, the air thick with exertion, until she saw her opening, a downward strike that forced him to raise his guard too high. With a twist, she let her blade graze his exposed hand. It was a shallow cut, nothing more than a warning, meant to humble him before she delivered the finishing stroke. But the instant his blood touched her weapon, the world shifted. The runes along the blade of Dominion ignited, flaring with crimson light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The glow raced from hilt to tip, searing symbols alive that had slumbered for generations. Caliph staggered back, stunned, the weight of the sword suddenly thrumming in her arm as though it recognized him, not her. Gasps rippled through the kneeling crowd. Then, almost as one, her people dropped fully to the ground, foreheads pressed to the earth in unison. It was no act of respect for her. They bowed to him. The human stared at the sword, confusion etched across his features. He looked at his bleeding palm, then at the vast sea of warriors now prostrating themselves, and his expression hardened not with triumph but with bewilderment. Caliph's chest tightened. This was not possible. The runes were tied to prophecy, to myths of a savior who would rise when their people were on the brink. That savior was meant to come from within, not from some foreigner who stumbled into their canyon. Yet the evidence burned in her hand, undeniable. Her mind rebelled against what she saw, clinging to anger as a shield. He had done nothing to earn their submission. He had not bled for their traditions, had not carried the burden of their history. And yet her clan, proud and unbending, now knelt to him as though destiny itself had crowned him master. She felt the betrayal deep within her bones, a fracture of identity more painful than any wound. The blade, once hers, seemed to hum in mockery. The human stepped back, his voice low and unsteady, but the silence of the canyon carried every word. I didn't ask for this. His tone held no arrogance, no satisfaction, only a confusion that mirrored her own, though his came without the sting of humiliation. Caliph wanted to strike him down, to end this before the lie of fate could root itself any deeper. But the sword pulsed again in her hand, alive with a power she had never touched before, its glow searing against her will. Her clan remained kneeling, unmoving, as if shackled by the weight of an oath they could not resist. She could not command them to rise, nor could she sever their gaze from him. The duel had ended, but nothing was resolved. Instead, something larger had awakened, something that threatened to unravel the very foundation of who she was. Kalith stood frozen, her blade burning with alien fire, while the human she had meant to humble became the unwilling center of a destiny that now bound them both. The canyon, once echoing with jeers and drums, was now hushed in reverence. The silence pressed down like a storm about to break, promising that the clash of swords had only been the beginning. Kalith stood rigid in the arena's center, the rune-lit sword trembling faintly in her grip, though her arm had never faltered in battle before. Around her, the kneeling mass of warriors remained unmoving, their silence reverent, oppressive. It was not obedience to her that bound them to the ground. It was the blade's awakening, a force older than memory, older than her line. The human still stared at his palm, as if searching for some rational explanation in the thin line of blood. His bewilderment made her fury sharper. He had done nothing, yet her people had yielded to him as though destiny itself had declared his dominion. Elders came forward from the shadows at the canyon's edge, their cloaks dragging against the dust. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if time itself had thickened. Kalith felt their gazes weigh upon her, not with censure, but with something worse, recognition. She knew what they would say before they spoke, yet hearing the words aloud struck her like a spear. The prophecy of dominion, intoned the eldest, his voice a brittle echo. The runes respond not to lineage, not to mastery, but to the blood of the offspring of distant stars. It is written. Whispers spread through the kneeling army like wind through dry leaves. Kalith's throat tightened. She had studied the prophecy as a child, dismissed it as a myth meant to soothe during times of famine and loss. The offspring were never defined. Some thought it meant a chosen scion of her people, others believed it meant a figure of their own kind yet unborn. No one had spoken of outsiders, not seriously, and yet here stood a human, dust-caked and weary, bound to the blade more completely in a moment than she had been in a lifetime. He lifted his gaze from the weapon to the elders, his brow furrowed. "I don't know your prophecy," he said, his voice raw, almost pleading. "I didn't come here for this. I only meant to prove I could stand." His sincerity rang clear, though Kalith found no comfort in it. His lack of ambition was somehow worse. At least a conqueror could be fought, resisted, hated without question. But this man's confusion made the rune's judgment appear, all the more deliberate, stripping away any illusion of accident. The prophecy had found him. Kalith's grip on the hilt tightened until her knuckles ached. Every part of her training urged her to reclaim control, strike him down, sever the blade's glow, restore her clan's faith in her. Yet even as the thought rose, the weapon throbbed against her palm, alive with power that resisted her will. She understood then that if she struck, the blade itself would betray her. The elders moved closer, their voices weaving together, recounting the verses carved into forgotten stone. When the world wanes, and the clans falter, the blade shall sleep until touched by the wanderer's blood. Then shall the oath awaken, and all shall kneel until the path is walked anew. The words had always sounded ceremonial, abstract. But now each syllable landed heavy, undeniable. The human's jaw tightened as he listened. "If what you say is true, then your oath isn't to me. It's to survival. That's what your ancestors wanted, wasn't it? A way for you to endure." His perspective unsettled Kalith. He spoke without reverence for their traditions, stripping away the weight of generations, reducing the prophecy to function rather than faith. And yet, his words carried an uncomfortable sense of clarity. The elders murmured, nodding faintly, though none dared declare outright what they already knew, that the blade's choice was absolute. Kalith felt heat rising under her skin, a flush of shame she could not conceal. She had been their champion, their proudest warrior, the bearer of a weapon that was meant to define her. In one careless drop of blood, he had unraveled her purpose. Her people now looked to him, even as he denied them. She turned away, unwilling to let them see the fracture in her composure. But she could not turn from her thoughts. Every memory of her training, every victory earned in combat, every oath sworn to uphold her clan's strength, all of it bent beneath this sudden shift. The blade that had sung in her grip was silent now except for its thrum of allegiance to him. She felt as though her very soul had been unmoored. The human shifted uncomfortably, aware of every eye upon him. "I can't be what you want," he said, more firmly this time. "I don't seek to rule you. I don't even understand your ways." "Yet you cannot refuse," an elder said. His tone was neither gentle nor harsh, merely factual. "The oath is bound. Our people bow not from choice, but from law written into the marrow of our line. To reject them now is to fracture the clan, to invite ruin." The human's gaze flickered to the sea of bowed figures, then back to the glowing runes. His expression hardened, not with pride, but with grim understanding. He saw the trap closing around him, saw the weight he had inherited without consent. "And if I walk away," he asked, "then half will follow, and half will resist," the elder replied. "Your leaving will ignite a war that will end us." The silence that followed was suffocating. Kalitha's heart pounded, her rage dissolving into something colder, fear. Not of him, but of the truth that even she could not deny. The blade had chosen, and their people's unity hung by a thread stretched taut over the human's unwilling shoulders. She looked at him then, truly looked. His stance was weary but unbroken, his eyes clear though shadowed by the enormity of the moment. He was no champion of their traditions, no warrior forged in their ways, yet he carried a resilience she could not dismiss. Perhaps that was why the blade had answered him, not for heritage, but for the stubborn endurance etched into his kind. The canyon remained hushed, every life within it suspended by the choice he had yet to make. Kalitha's own breath came shallow, caught between resentment and reluctant recognition. The duel was over, but a far greater conflict had only begun. And though she wished to despise him, she could not escape the truth that her future, her clan's future, was now bound to his decision. He clenched his wounded hand into a fist, the blood drying against his skin. "Then it seems," he said slowly, each word weighted with reluctant resolve, "that walking away is no longer an option." The sod fled once more, as though sealing his admission, and the canyon's silence deepened until even the dust seemed to pause mid-E. The days that followed were steeped in tension, as if the canyon itself resisted the shift in power. The warriors who had knelt in the arena still bent their heads when the human passed, their loyalty bound not by choice but by the oath encoded in their blood. Yet obedience did not mean acceptance. Beneath the stillness, Kalith felt the fracture widening, a fault line ready to split her people apart. She walked the camps at night, hearing the whispers carried through firelight, some voices reverent, others venomous. To many, the prophecy had been fulfilled. To others, it had been corrupted. The human moved among them with visible unease, his every gesture measured, as though aware that the slightest misstep might ignite rebellion. He gave no orders at first, only listened, asking questions about supplies, about terrain, about how the clan chose its leaders. His manner was strange, more like a student than a master, and the sight of proud warriors explaining customs to him was both humbling and infuriating. Kalith shadowed him often, half by duty, half by suspicion. She watched the way he listened, the way he weighed each word, and though she sought weakness in him, what she found instead was persistence. He did not demand, yet he did not bend. For her, the days were a torment. The blade of dominion still glowed faintly at her hip, as though reminding her that she carried it only at his sufferance. Every time she touched its hilt, the hum of power reminded her that her strength was no longer her own. She despised the helplessness, despised him for causing it, and despised herself most of all for sensing that her people's survival now depended on his reluctant stewardship. The breaking point came swiftly. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a cry rang out from the encampment's edge. A group of warriors had gathered, their blades drawn, faces twisted with fury. They did not kneel. They stood defiant, a sharp contrast to the obedient masses behind them. Their leader, a broad-shouldered veteran named Vorak, stepped forward and spat at the ground between himself and the human. "We bow to no outsider," Vorak growled. "The blade's glow is trickery. The prophecy is ours, not his. If our elders are too blind to see it, then we will carve truth in blood." The human's jaw tightened, though he said nothing at first. Kalitha's own heart pounded as the crowd pressed closer, torn between obedience to the oath and loyalty to old pride. For a moment, silence reigned, the air thick with the inevitability of violence. Finally, the human spoke, his voice steady though edged with steel. "I never asked for your submission. But whether you believe in prophecy or not, your people already kneel. If you rebel, you don't fight me, you fight them." He gestured to the thousands still bent in silent obedience, his words forcing Vorak to confront the truth. Any uprising would fracture the clan, spill kin against kin. Vorak sneered, unconvinced. "Better we fight each other than serve an alien pretender." He lunged forward, blade raised, his followers surging behind him. The clash was immediate. Steel against steel, a sudden eruption of chaos within the camp. The loyalists, bound by the oath, rose to defend their chosen, while the rebels struck with raw fury. Kalith found herself in the heart of it, the pulse of battle driving her limbs before thought could interfere. She cut through Vorak's men with precision, her movements born of instinct, though every strike was fueled by a deeper conflict inside her. She saw the human fighting nearby, not with the elegance of her people, but with a stubborn pragmatism. He ducked low, used the terrain, wielded his blade with an unpredictability that turned mistakes into openings. He was no master, yet he refused to fall, each breath drawn with grim resolve. Twice he was nearly struck down, and twice Kalith intervened, her sword deflecting blows meant for him before she could think better of it. The realization unsettled her more than the blood on her hands. Why had she chosen to shield him? Was it duty to the clan, or some reluctant acknowledgement that his survival mattered to her as well? The battle stretched long into the night, dust and blood mingling until the lines between rebel and loyalist blurred. When at last Vorak fell, struck down by the human's blade in a desperate clash, the remaining rebels scattered, their conviction shattered. The silence that followed was jagged, filled with the weight of loss. Bodies lay across the ground, the cost of a clan divided. The human stood breathing heavily, sweat and dust streaking his face, his blade slick with crimson. He did not raise it in triumph, did not call for further allegiance. Instead, he looked upon the dead with something Kalith did not expect: sorrow. He whispered words too low for her to catch, a mourning not just for his enemies but for the fracture that had forced them to strike. Her chest tightened again, though not with rage this time. Watching him there, blooded and unbowed, she saw something she could not dismiss, a leader not born of tradition or prophecy, but of endurance. He fought not to rule, but to keep others from destroying themselves. And though the thought burned her pride, Kalith felt a flicker of something dangerously close to respect. As dawn crept over the canyon, painting the battlefield in pale light, the loyalists gathered once more. They knelt again, as the oath compelled, though now it seemed less a reflex and more choice. Kalith looked at their bowed heads, then at the humans standing amidst them, and understood the truth she had resisted. Her people's loyalty was shifting, not just by prophecy, but by the weight of his actions. She sheathed the blade of dominion, its glow pulsing faintly as though in agreement. The fracture remained, the scars of rebellion still raw, but something new had begun to take shape in the silence after battle. Kalith did not know if it was hope or doom, only that it bound her fate ever more tightly to his. The war within her heart was far from over, but she knew with certainty that neither she nor her people could turn away now. The human had become more than an intruder. He had become the axis on which their future turned, and she, whether she willed it or not, was already caught in his orbit. The smell of blood had barely faded from the canyon floor when a messenger arrived, staggering beneath the weight of grim tidings. His armor was battered, his voice hoarse with dust, but his words carried a weight heavier than wounds. The Empire was moving again, the same distant overlords who had once enslaved Kalitha's people, their banners seen rising on the horizon. They came not in rumor but in force, their vanguard burning outlying villages and pressing steadily toward the canyon. The news spread like fire, searing through the clans, stripping away the fragile silence left after the rebellion. Kalith felt her chest constrict as she listened. Her people had broken themselves on the inside. Now their old masters came to finish what the rebellion had begun. The prophet's shadow loomed darker than ever. She glanced at the human, and though his face betrayed no fear, she could see the calculation flickering in his eyes. He understood the truth. A divided clan could not withstand an empire's march. That night, The council gathered beneath the pale light of the moons. Elders spoke of honor, of vengeance, of the necessity of resistance. Yet their words were sharp with doubt. Some wanted to surrender, believing servitude preferable to extinction. Others wanted to fight, though they knew their numbers were too few. The argument swelled until it threatened to dissolve into chaos. Then all eyes turned to him, the outsider, the chosen of the blade. He remained silent for a long moment, his expression somber. Finally, he spoke, and his words fell not like commands but like truths laid bare. You don't need a master. You need a future. And right now, the only path to survival is to stand together. Not because prophecy says so, not because your blood compels it, but because if you don't, the empire will break you piece by piece until nothing remains. His voice was steady, neither raised nor adorned with ceremony, yet Caliph felt its impact ripple through the chamber. For all his reluctance, he did not shrink from the responsibility. He did not dress his leadership in glory. He carried it as one carries a burden. And perhaps that was why his words struck deeper than any elders. Afterward, Caliph found him standing alone at the canyon's edge, staring out into the night where the empire's fires glowed faintly on the horizon. She approached without sound, yet he spoke before she could. I didn't come here to lead, he said quietly. But if I walk away now, your people are finished. I don't want to be a conqueror, Caliph. I just want to make sure you live to see another dawn. His honesty disarmed her more than any blade could. She had spent her life wielding strength as proof of worth, yet here was a man who bore the weight of destiny without seeking power. She realized, with a clarity that unsettled her, that the prophet's choice had not been an accident. The runes had awakened not to blood alone, but to spirit. The following days were filled with preparation. Scouts reported enemy movements, smiths reforged weapons, and warriors trained until their bodies broke. For the first time since the rebellion, Caliph saw unity taking root, not from fear of the blade, but from the way the human carried himself among them. He fought beside them, ate beside them, bled beside them in drills, never once setting himself above. The sight stirred something deep in her people, something even prophecy could not command: belief. When the empire's vanguard finally descended into the canyon, the air trembled with the clash of drums and steel. Their armor gleamed with cruel efficiency, their banners casting shadows across the sand. Caliph drew her sword, the runes alive with fire that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. At her side, the human raised his blade, no rune upon it, yet it seemed no less significant. The battle erupted in a storm of dust and blood. Caliph carved through the enemy with ruthless precision, the Dominion blade singing louder than ever before. Each strike left trails of searing light, not just cutting but burning, as if fueled by something greater than her own strength. She realized then that the blade no longer answered to her alone. It answered to the bond forged between her people and the human who had chosen to stand with them. She caught glimpses of him amid the chaos, his movements unpredictable yet unyielding, turning near defeats into sudden victories. Once he stumbled, surrounded by enemy soldiers, and instinct drove her to his side. Together they fought back to back, her precision balanced by his resilience, their blades striking as though guided by a single rhythm. Around them, the clan rallied, voices rising not in fear but in defiance. The empire faltered. What should have been a swift conquest became a grueling fight against a people who refused to break. The vanguard fell back, their banners retreating across the canyon floor, their discipline unraveling under the weight of unexpected resistance. When the dust settled, the ground was littered with the bodies of invaders, and the survivors of the clan stood blooded but unbowed. Caliph lowered her blade, its runes glowing brighter than she had ever seen, as though feeding on the unity that had carried them to victory. The human stood near her, his chest heaving, his face streaked with blood and sweat. Their eyes met, and for the first time she did not see an intruder or an accident of fate. She saw a leader, one chosen not by heritage, but by the will to endure. The warriors gathered around them, their voices rising in a chant that shook the canyon walls. They knelt once more, but this time the motion carried no sense of compulsion. It was not prophecy that drove them, nor the blade's command. It was choice. Caliph felt the weight lift from her chest, though the path ahead remained uncertain. The empire would come again, stronger, and their survival was far from assured. Yet something had changed irrevocably. Her people no longer bowed out of obligation, they followed out of conviction. The human raised his sword in acknowledgement, not triumph, and Knelt knew in that moment that their fates had entwined beyond unbinding. Together they had turned prophecy into reality, not by its words, but by their own. The future lay shrouded in war and hardship, but it was theirs to claim, and for the first time, Knelt did not fear it. She welcomed it. The victory over the Empire's vanguard left the canyon thick with smoke and silence. Fires burned in the distance, curling upward like the final breath of the slain, while the survivors of the clan moved slowly among the fallen, tending to wounds and gathering their dead. The triumph was real, but it tasted bitter, edged with exhaustion and the certainty that this was only the first strike in a much greater war. Knelt stood atop a ridge of stone, her blade dim at her side, staring down at the broken field. For all the lives they had preserved, she could not ignore the shadow of what still loomed ahead. The Empire did not send vanguards to win, they sent them to measure. The human stood not far from her, his face unreadable in the dying light. The blood had been scrubbed from his hands, but his expression carried the same weight as hers. He had fought as one of them, endured as one of them, yet he remained apart, set apart not by his will but by the blade's decree. The clan chanted his name in reverence, voices rising with unbidden loyalty, and though he did not seek it, their devotion deepened with each passing hour. Knelt felt the unease coil tighter in her chest. She could no longer deny that his leadership held her people together, yet each moment they placed faith in him was another moment her own place in their hearts eroded. As night fell, the council gathered in secret, torches flickering against the canyon walls. Knelt accompanied the human into the circle of elders, their faces lined with grief and resolve. They spoke plainly. The Empire would return in full force, and no amount of valor would hold them back. The clans could not hope to defeat an empire born from stars. Their only chance lay in alliance, uniting with other clans scattered across the wastes, clans who had grown distant, hostile, or resigned to despair. Alone, they would be crushed. Together, perhaps they might endure. The human listened in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the fire. When the council finished, he looked to Knelt, and she felt the weight of his expectation. He would not speak for her people without her voice. Though destiny had placed him above them, he treated her as though she still shared the burden. That small act of respect made her throat tighten. She had no choice but to nod. If alliances were their only chance, then it must be her who carried the message. For though the blade's fire bound them, she remained her people's blood, their warrior, the one who had carried their traditions long before he came. The journey began at dawn. Knelt rode at the human side, the blade of dominion sheathed across her back, its runes faintly pulsing with every heartbeat. Scouts flanked them, wary of ambush, and behind them marched a small escort, just enough to show strength without provoking fear. The road through the wastes was harsh, barren rock stretching beneath a merciless sun, but Knelt barely noticed the heat. Her mind turned ceaselessly over what awaited them, not battle, but negotiation. And negotiations, she knew, could cut deeper than swords. They came first to the Ashen clan, their camp built among the bones of a long-dead beast. The warriors there sneered at the sight of the human, their eyes sharp with mistrust. Knelt spoke first, invoking the battle they had won, the prophecy that had awakened, the need for unity. But it was his words that shifted the tide. He did not speak of destiny. He spoke of survival, of children who would live or die depending on whether they stood apart or together. His voice lacked Polish, yet it carried a weight that even the skeptical could not dismiss. One by one, the Ashen warriors lowered their weapons. They agreed to send warriors when the Empire came again. From there they traveled to the Stoneheart clan, where resistance ran deeper. Knelt found her own voice challenged. Old grudges resurfaced, accusations of arrogance, of forgotten debts. She nearly drew steel more than once, her patience stretched thin by insult. Yet again the human cut through with unexpected clarity, diffusing tempers not with dominance but with a kind of stubborn humility. He admitted ignorance of their ways, but argued that even ignorance could learn, and that no empire would care about their pride when the slaughter began. His bluntness disarmed them in ways her sharpened words never could. Knelt watched it unfold with a growing conflict inside her. She had expected him to falter, to be undone by his lack of knowledge, to reveal himself as unworthy of the prophecy's burden. Instead, he showed a strange strength that had nothing to do with combat or command. Where she wielded tradition, he wielded truth. Where she struck with the blade, he struck with words that carried the same raw inevitability. Her resentment twisted into something more complex, a reluctant recognition that unsettled her more than the Empire's approach. By the time they reached the final clan, the Skyborn, word had already spread. Rumors of the human with the glowing blade's allegiance raced ahead of them, carried by frightened travelers and curious traders. The Skyborn received them with wary ceremony, and though their chieftain tested the human with questions meant to wound, he endured without flinching. It was Calith who felt the sting, watching the man who had once been her rival stand as the fulcrum on which all their hopes now balanced. When at last the alliances were sealed, Calith stood beside him beneath a canopy of stars, listening to the distant crackle of campfires. The united clans would march together when the Empire returned, bound not just by prophecy but by choice. Yet victory was no closer than before. They had bought hope, nothing more. She looked at him then, truly looked, and realized that hope might be enough to change the course of history. But deep within her, the conflict remained unresolved. She could not decide if she stood beside him out of duty, prophecy, or something more dangerous. Every time his gaze lingered on her, steady and unassuming, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. And though the stars burned bright above them, she could not shake the feeling that their greatest trials were yet to come. The Empire came sooner than anyone had expected. Dawn had barely broken when the horizon bled fire, streaks of burning light cutting across the sky as Imperial warships descended like predators. The earth trembled beneath the roar of their engines, and already the allied clans stirred with fay. Camps scattered, warriors gathered weapons, and leaders shouted orders to hold the fragile unity that had been so painstakingly forged. Calith stood at the heart of the encampment, the blade of Dominion drawn and humming with quiet anticipation, as though it too sensed the approach of the storm. Her pulse matched its rhythm, fast and unyielding, while across the circle, the human readied himself in silence. For all his calm, she could see the weight pressing on him. Every eye turned to him first, every voice waited for his command, and even those who had once doubted now leaned toward him instinctively. He had become their anchor, and she their sword. Together, they bore the burden of hope, yet hope felt painfully thin beneath the thunder of descending warships. Calith forced her unease down, stepping to his side as the clans awaited guidance. The human raised his voice, clear and steady, and spoke not of destiny but of choice, of how each warrior here could choose to stand, to make their defiance matter, even if the Empire sought to erase them. His words spread like sparks on dry tinder, igniting something fiercer than fear. The first wave struck with merciless precision. Metallic beasts, soldiers encased in steel and light, poured from the ships, their rifles tearing through the air with bursts of plasma. The clans answered with battle cries that shook the sky, blades and spears meeting against armor, the very earth scorched by the clash. Calith plunged forward, the blade of Dominion erupting in a flare that blinded the enemy's front line. Every strike carved through steel as though it were cloth, the runes burning brighter than ever before. Yet each swing tore at her strength, draining her body even as the blade demanded more. She fought with fury, aware that her fall would mean not only her death, but the collapse of those who believed in her. The human fought differently. He had no runes, no ancient weapon, only raw will and a mind sharpened by desperation. He adapted to the Empire's machines with startling speed, dismantling their formations with strikes of opportunity, drawing their fire away from the clans, forcing them to stumble where they expected submission. Calith watched him between strikes, the sight both infuriating and awe-inspiring. He was no longer a stranger bound to prophecy. He was their equal in sacrifice, perhaps even their superior in resolve. But the Empire's strength was endless. For every wave cut down, another descended. The clans began to falter, their voices breaking into cries of pain, their formations collapsing under the storm. Calith felt the panic rippling outward, threatening to undo the fragile unity. She staggered back to the human, her breath ragged, her blade dripping light. "We cannot hold," she said, the words bitter as ash. Yet he met her gaze with something she could not name, defiance, or perhaps belief stronger than her own. "We don't need to hold," he answered. "We need to break them here." At first, she thought him mad, but then she felt it, the blade thrumming, not only with power but with something deeper, a resonance that stretched beyond her own flesh. The clans felt it too. Their knees had bent once when its runes fled. Now, as Knelt raised it high, the runes blazed with a radiance that cast shadows across the battlefield. Warriors who had faltered rose again, their voices merging in a single roar, their strikes growing fiercer as though the blade lent them its fire. The Empire's line shuddered for the first time. Knelt swung, and the runes erupted into a storm of light that tore a swath through the enemy. But the power was not hers alone. It poured through her into them all, binding clan to clan, warrior to warrior, as though the blade had woven them into a single living force. The Empire recoiled, stumbling beneath the sudden unity, and for a heartbeat the tide shifted. Yet Knelt knew the truth. The blade was not a gift. It was a demand, and it would not cease until it consumed everything she had left. Her vision blurred, her arms burned, and she swayed on her feet even as the warriors around her pressed forward. The human saw it too, his face tightening with a fear he tried to mask. He seized her arm, steadying her when she nearly fell, and spoke with quiet urgency. "Don't burn yourself out. You are not the blade. They follow you, not it." His words cut sharper than any steel, for she realized then what she had denied. The prophecy had never been about her weapon or even the runes. It had been about choice, about faith. The clans did not kneel because of the glowing steel. They knelt because they saw in her and in him a defiance worth following. The blade was only a spark. They were the fire. With that knowledge, she lowered the weapon, letting its glow dim to a steady pulse. She fought not with its consuming light, but with her own strength, her strikes measured, her will sharpened. The human fought at her side, their movements aligning as though guided by something older than fate. Together, they drove into the Empire's heart, not invincible, but unstoppable enough to force retreat. When the last ship lifted, scarred and broken from the field, the clan stood blooded yet alive. The ground was littered with ash and ruin, the sky streaked with smoke, but they remained. Exhaustion pressed on Knelt like a weight she could barely bear, yet within it pulsed a strange certainty. They had faced the Empire and lived. The human stood beside her, silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the enemy fled. Knelt gripped the blade at her side, its runes faintly glowing as though in satisfaction. She knew this was not the end. The Empire would return, stronger and more determined. But now the clans were no longer fractured tribes awaiting conquest. They were something greater, bound not by prophecy but by choice, and she would no longer deny the truth. It was he who had given them that choice. For the first time, Knelt allowed herself a quiet smile, though it carried no peace. War still loomed, but so too did possibility. And in that fragile balance between ruin and hope, she and the human stood, not as rivals, not as reluctant allies, but as the uncertain beginning of something far larger than themselves.